Okay, I think it is time to start this webinar. So I would like to welcome all of you. Bienvenidos to the webinar Strengthening Regulation of Private Security in Peru, presented by the In-Country Working Group in Peru. We are grateful that you were able to take time to be with us today. My name is Jose Abad Puelles, and I am the Policy Director of the Voluntary Principles Secretariat. I am here today with Patricia Jacopucci of the Secretariat too, who is invisible, but she's actually putting on this event. So I would like to tell you that the Peru Working Group was one of the first groups that has been operational for over 10 years. And its activities are geared toward implementing the United Nations Guiding Principles, as well as facilitating effective country-level implementation of the voluntary principles. The Peru Working Group paved the way for the creation of other groups by demonstrating that benefit of multi-stakeholder engagement to build on-the-ground capacity to identify and act on local in-country challenges related to the implementation of the voluntary principles and working to identify joint solutions to those challenges. The Peru Working Group improves in-country stakeholder coordination and engagement with its members, which includes host government officials, corporates, and civil society organizations, leading to constructive multi-stakeholder dialogue. Today, our distinguished panelists will present an overview of their project, Private Security in Peru, towards the introduction of international human rights standards, funded by the Voluntary Principles Association. Our panelists are members of the Institute of Democracy and Human Rights of the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, IDEHPUCP. They are Elizabeth Salmon, who is the Executive Director of IDEHPUCP, Professor of International Law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, and the Chairperson of the United Nations Human Rights Council Advisory Committee. We also have from the IDEHPUCP, Bruce Barnaby, who is the Coordinator of the Academic and Research Area of IDEHPUCP, Professor of Human Rights at the same university, and currently the Coordinator of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights Guiding Principles and the Voluntary Principles in Peru. Once all the panelists have presented, we are also very pleased to have Tom Mather. He's the newly appointed Head of Compliance of ICOCA, who will serve as a discussant and provide some thoughts and reflections regarding this project. Tom will also kick off our Q&A session that will take us to the conclusion. Before we begin with the program, so I will just review a few housekeeping matters with you. So this session is scheduled for 1 hour, and we are using, as you can see, the Zoom application. The webinar is open to the general public. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available in our website. Please, we encourage you to post all your questions at any time in our Q&A button. So please don't forget to use that button if you want to post any question to our panelists. I think this is all from my side. Now let's start this presentation. So please, to you, Elizabeth, and thank you for being here.
Hello, I'm pleased to participate in the presentation of this analysis of the private security in Peru, diagnosis of the training in human rights, which is part of a larger project named Evaluation of the Study Program for Training and Improvement of Private Security in Peru towards the incorporation of international human rights standards, generously funded by the Voluntary Principles Initiative. In the first place, it is essential to mention that the following institutions have conducted this analysis: the Institute of Democracy and Human Rights, IDEHPUCP, which is an academic unit of the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, members of International Code of Conduct Association, ICOCA, since 2013, and coordinators of the Working Group on Voluntary Principles in Peru. The Peruvian Working Group is a multi-stakeholder platform dedicated to promoting guiding principles and voluntary principles. It gathers companies, government actors, civil society entities, and observers, and has three main objectives: to promote the discussion and dissemination of good practices, lessons learned, and international standards on security and human rights, to define and guide the process of implementation of the voluntary principles in Peru, and to conduct advocacy activities before the state and groups of interest in favor of adequate policies on security and human rights. This working group has had a leading role during the design and promotion of National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. It is important to mention that the Peruvian government approved the National Action Plan in June of 2021, after a 3-year process of dialogue and design between various actors involved in business activities and human rights. One crucial aspect to be considered is this process is the country's political crisis in the last 5 years. In effect, the diagnosis and design process was carried out under a context of political instability marked by 4 presidents in 5 years, and consequently high rotation of authorities related to public forces. However, this political stress was compensated by the constant and broad participation of diverse social and business sectors, which made possible the promotion of the plan. It is satisfactory to mention that, notwithstanding many adverse factors, Peru has been the 3rd country in Latin America in approving a national action plan. Another critical aspect being mentioned is the increasing relevance of the security sector and business and human rights. This is related to the prevalence of social conflicts and makes even more important the development of a protection framework against the negative consequences of the use of force and the adoption of human rights approach in business management. The diagnosis highlights the role of the private security sector, pointing out the excessive use of force during social protest and concern from international human rights monitoring mechanisms, the lack of provisions that regulate the use of force in the sector of private security providers, and the relevance and need to implement training in human rights. This diagnosis led to establishing the necessity of a national action plan indicators regarding the private security sector. Action 28 of this National Action Plan calls for an analysis report on applying standards of use of force in the provision of extraordinary policy services and in companies that provide and contract private security to formulate normative guidelines. To underline the importance of this plan, it might be helpful to remind some examples of possible negative impacts on human rights regarding the private security sector. In the extractive context, it is well known the case of Maxima Acuña. On November 16, 2015, unidentified persons believed to work for the Yanacocha Mining Company trespassed onto the land of human rights defender Mrs. Maxima Acuña. Before that, Maxima had denounced threatening situations against her and her family, including intimidation, aggression, and material damage to her property, to desist from defending her territory. So far, the highest court decision has confirmed the innocence of Maxima Acuña about the charge of usurpation was made against her. Another example from the urban context involves the murder of a man in a mall caused by 5 security agents. The victim, Alex Gensolén, was murdered on September 14 of 2021 by 5 security agents in a mall during an abusive intervention and excessive force. There is ample evidence of the lack of protocols in these interventions. This case shows the insufficient regulation that currently exists for the private security sector and the importance of discussing with all the sectors of the society the instruments needed to oversee the progressive use of force. These cases are not exceptional. In our research, we have been able to categorize some typical negative impacts over the protection of human rights, confrontational scenarios where cultural differences are exacerbated, constant use of verbal aggressions with the racist and sexual connotations, lack of access to international mechanisms to remediation and accountability, disproportionate use of force in conflict contexts. On the other side, the behavior of the private security sector can harm their own agents. Some of the impacts that we have identified are maltreatment, mistreatment by the public, cases of discrimination and verbal aggressions with, again, racist and social status connotations, even physical aggression, abuse of their labor rights, arbitrary firings, labor exploitation, lack of transparency in the contracting conditions, and harassments because of the unionization initiatives. Workers as well are under inadequate conditions and lack of recognition and attention during the first month of the COVID-19 pandemic. Differential treatment for being part or not of a union, characteristics of their type of work, low interaction with people, impact on their mental health. That is why they emphasize emotion management and good working conditions. This quick overview of the situation revealed by the analysis makes evident the necessity to strengthen capacities on human rights protections over the private security sector. Training human rights improves the protection of human rights, helps to present adverse impacts over all the actors involved in business activities or interacted with them, and it's an essential part of the government's obligations to avoid further violations of human rights. To improve the protection of human rights implies strengthening the capacities of public and private actors helps fulfill the duties of upholding and protect human rights. On the other side, prevention means, among other things, that companies should have as much information as possible about their human rights behavior to strengthen their internal process of accountability. And finally, it is also crucial to mention that the state must guarantee effective reparation mechanisms to counteract or repair any damage to human rights produced within the framework of business activity. These are, however, only some general ideas generated by our research, which Bruce now continued to develop. Thank you.
Well, good morning. My name is Bruce Barnaby, as already been said. And first of all, thanks for the invitation to talk about the private security sector in Peru and to present the results of our research. And as Elizabeth was saying before, and lack of appropriate training policy over this sector could have direct effect towards the protection of human rights. But let's take a look of the sector to understand its main characteristics and challenges over the design and implementation of a training policy. Okay, that's better. Over the last years, there has been a quick increase of the number of private security companies, from 540 companies over 2011 to 988 companies in 2020, with over 1,216 branch offices around the country. It is an increase of over 83% of the total amount of companies over the last 10 years. Some of the reasons for this increase over the last years are related to problems with security due to the increased level of delinquency in the cities, problems to access public forces in many parts of the territory, urbanization of new territories next to the cities, and expansion of the extractive sector in rural parts of the country. Another characteristics in this sector is the close relationship that its members have with the armed forces and with retired armed forces, considering, for example, public servants, owners of companies, or its representative, or the agents that work in this sector. Due to the high social conflict scenarios, that includes conflict between companies, government, and especially public sector forces and communities, many of them part of indigenous population in the Andes and in the Amazonia of Peru. Over the last years, the Ombudsman Office and the executive power have reported an increase over the amount of social conflicts that leads to a confrontation and, tragically, the high amount of fatalities and wounded people. According to the Ombudsman Office, from 2006 to 2019, 282 people died over these conflicts, including 88% of civil society members and 12% of members of the police. In the same period, over 5,023 people end up wounded, 66% of them civilians, and 34% members of the public forces. Many of these times, according to what we have found in our interviews, includes verbal and physical aggression by private security personnel towards the local population and inside these conflicts. Another high relevance variable to take into account and to understand private security sector is informality. There are no official numbers of activities that usually require security services and the difficulties to create data from the government offices. But we know is that according to our fieldwork, the economic cost of formalization and the cumbersome procedures create incentives to some companies to remain in informal sector. Also, SUCAMEC, the regulatory entity, because of the logistical and territorial limitations, oversee more formal companies than informal ones. Let's talk a little bit about SUCAMEC. To understand this sector, it's important to know about its governmental regulatory office. It is in charge of not only private security services, but also manufacture, trade, and use of arms and explosive and pyrotechnic products for civil use. This diversity of topics complicates capacity to oversee and control effectively the implementation of the regulatory framework. This is even more complicated in cities different from Lima, our capital, where extractive companies are usually operating. SUCAMEC was created over 10 years ago. It used to be an office inside the Ministry of Interior, but in order to straighten up the regulation and accountability of these topics, this institution gained more independence with this new creation. About our research, before going into the findings, just to say that we have 3 different steps. First, a desk work and part where we managed to gather information from different countries, from our regulatory framework, and different bibliography. And fieldwork, where we have some interviews and surveys, and an assessment that we did, and that was our results right now. Our framework, and we use to compare with our public policy, we use the human rights framework with the guiding principles and the voluntary principles. We use some public policies and with the human rights and base approach and inclusion, including participation, accountability, and other facts that are important to understand, and also the gender perspective and other approaches that includes the vulnerability of different actors in this sector. We also have a quick look to other countries in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Guatemala in order to understand what kind of options, what kind of other policies, what kind of other activities they're doing, so we can also improve our public policy as well. Regarding our fieldwork, we had 19 interviews in 2020, which includes civil society, trainers, private sector, agents and unions, and public sector. But we also compare and use the interviews that we had in 2019 when we could do these interviews face-to-face, and we managed to travel to different cities around Peru and outside Lima, where we also work as well. And we have 18 interviews for the diagnosis for the National Action Plan, where we interview members of civil society, private sector, and public sector in Puno, Cusco, and Cajamarca. So with all this information we gathered, and we managed to have some conclusions over the sector. We have, this is the project, we have the research part, there is this first part that we're talking about. Now we have to do a policy paper. We'll explain that next steps later. And we are also in a process of communicating and dissemination of the content of all the activities we're doing. Okay, so regarding the regulatory framework that we have in Peru, currently there are two laws that apply to this sector. One is from 2006, even before the existence of SUCAMIC. In 2015, with a new institution, they approved a new law, but it's only applicable in part because it's necessary to approve it in further regulation. So even now, we are currently have a regulatory framework that have created these CFOCs, that specialized centers for training. They are not functioning, they are not implemented yet. So instead, we right now have a SUCAMIC that is in charge of the training, but but have delegated these competencies to private security companies themselves, but using a centralized study program that SUCAMIC approved. We will see in a bit some positive and negative notes regarding this design right now. Also, SUCAMIC have certified, have the competencies to certify instructors. We're the only ones allowed to have these training programs, and that have to be hired by private security companies to these training programs. So for this policy in particular, we have all these actors that we have to take into account to analyze the policy. The public office, SUCAMIC, instructors that have to be certified by SUCAMIC, and private security companies who are currently in charge of the training programs, security agents, who are not only informal, but in informal companies as well, and the companies and other institutions that require the security and they create the market itself. So our fundings will be separated in these three different topics. First, access of various actors to training, its content, which includes the study program and virtualization in times of COVID, which have created some challenges and opportunities as well. And finally, some additional training from private security sector that could help us also to improve our policy in particular. Regarding the regulatory barriers for accessing this training, due to high levels of informality, high requirements to human rights training can hinder formalization of private security companies. It means that higher number of private security companies is a higher number of agents without no training. So more informality, more requirements, more informality, less agents with training. So that's a problem that we have right now if we want to approach the informality market in Peru. From our field work, we heard some complaints from formal companies because they obviously have higher expenses to operate and higher levels to accountability, which many considers as an unequal competition compared to formal companies. One of the main problems that we see here is that the policy should increase its accountability to those formal companies or even public agencies who hire irregular private security companies, at least trying to increase some incentive to formalization of the sector. Regarding technical barriers, training programs should be implemented in the offices or locations of the private security companies. This is a challenge to smaller companies, which will have to find a different place or have a training program without an adequate infrastructure. As we talked before, activities outside Lima are usually more difficult to implement. This goes even increasing the amount of coordination with SUCAMIC, includes planning the course and reported to SUCAMIC in advance, twice in advance, two more times in advance, in order to be able to oversee it. Due to the low capacity of the decentralized offices, the SUCAMIC decentralized offices. The training must necessarily take place under office hours and no more than 10 academic hours per day, with at least 1 hour of refreshment. This could make difficult to access some of the members of the sector who have to work as well in another thing, or have to cover some shifts before going to the training. Regarding the barriers for the virtual mode, regulations for conducting virtual courses mandate that companies and students must have specific digital resources: computer, tablet, wired or wireless broadband internet, adequate microphone, etc. The latter can be a challenge, taking into account the existence of digital gaps here in Peru, even more when there is a generational factor involved. The virtual modality imposes a reduction in academic hours that training can have per day, and 5 academic hours instead of 10, and the maximum capacity of companies must respect in training, only 30 participants in each training. This leads to the course very long and imposes difficulties when reconciliating with working hours. In 2020, it was estimated that over 11,000 registered agents, active agents regularly registered in the country. Over the years, there has been an attempt to guarantee basic criteria for selection and supervision of private security operational personnel. Although the process is extremely cumbersome, the requirements include not having a criminal, police, or judicial record, discharged from and not have been discharged from armed forces, having a good physical and psychological capacity, among others. According to our interviews, agents usually have a positive perception about this sector. They consider it to be an easy job to access. The requirements are not very high, and allows obtaining an amount just above the minimum wage of an 8-hour schedule, and the possibility of accessing the benefits of entering the payroll of the company. Regarding some vulnerable groups, according to the regulations, people with disabilities, for example, can provide services, but no information has been found regarding accessibility courses, discrimination, and possible specific regulations regarding this population. Women continue to be an important minority in the sector, although they have increased, and according to the interviews carried out without any official data, it emerged that they are strongly discriminated against when being hired and in the exercise of their function, which entails that that is why not a very high percentage of enrollment in the training courses. In the context of the mining activity, it has been seen that security personnel come mainly from outside and not from the same communities, due to the difficulty of training these people and due to the distance between the communities and the nearest training centers in the cities. Regarding instructors, and another key part of the policy, and to be accredited by SOCAMEC among various requirements, it is requested that they are professionals with a university or a technical degree, and they can be members of the public forces in a retirement situation, and this limits the entry of civil society people who have extensive experience in the field and who normally have more experience in the sector regarding the relationship with the vulnerable groups, and therefore have greater needs to adapting the content to the reality of the security personnel and to be trained. Likewise, having a greater presence of instructors who do not come from the armed forces would help to strengthen the change reactive approach to a situation to a more prevention-oriented approach in the training. As documented in the list of courses of which accreditation is requested, the respective syllables of the courses and their documented curriculum are requested. From there, you go to a reading exam, from which you can find the question bank on the same SOCAMEC page. This has thought at the time to facilitate access to greater number of instructors, but it could generate that they only access to this training by memory. They don't actually have to gain some capacities in order to pass the exam. The instructor only have to know what will be in the exam, and the agents will only have to know what they have to mark in order to pass these exams. We will see that with this in the content of the training. The structure of the content of the training, it contains 2 different parts: a basic training and an improvement training. The basic training should be done in the beginning and improvement training should be done a couple of years after you've been working as an agent. Both of them contain 3 different modules, a legal, a technical, and a self-defense module. The first basic training is 60 academic hours that includes 11 courses, and this improvement training has 35 academic hours that includes 7 courses. The human rights part is one of the topics of the legal part, so it's only a part of one of the 3 modules, and it's mixed with the national regulation. For example, the use of force and the Constitution in general. There is no additional document. There is no additional document by the regulatory entity that established guidelines in order to standardize teaching. Ideally, that would be one of the new institutions' objectives that have not been implemented until now. And at the same time, would streamline SUCAMEC's evaluation process and will improve the role of SUCAMEC in the evaluation process. At the moment, they're carried out individually to each instructor, and they contemplate the validation of each syllable presented. So there's no way to find a standardization of the program. That is clearly cumbersome and unnecessary procedure. Regarding to teaching of classes, a difficulty pointed by the instructors in the interviews that they do not have enough time to adequately develop the contents of the courses. It is indicated that the area of private security is constantly updated, which is why it is necessary for the classes to address the changes in the sector, such as the use of technology tools and the ethical implications according to the advances of the area. Another aspect pointed by the instructors is related to the content of the courses and the instructor's discretion in choosing the contents and its methodologies. It is criticized that improvement courses are repetitive. Therefore, it is proposed that they be diversified and differentiate according to the years of career of the security personnel to the position they can fill in the work area. That happens because if you have 2 years there in the sector, you have the same course as someone that have already 10 years in the sector. Human rights contents, the students of these courses tell us that in their interviews that they do not remember the training received in human rights, while they mention some content regarding the Constitution and some general words in abstract and they are really far from what they have to do in the field. Therefore, human rights training turns out to be minimal, and it is necessary to reinforce the content related to international human rights treaties and the ethical obligations that its security agents must comply with. In the interviews also, it is required topic to place greater emphasis on the recognition of the differential effects on human rights of each vulnerable groups with whom private security agents have communication, such as women, children, adolescents, community, LGBTQ, older adults or immigrants and other groups. Likewise, the omission of this teaching of labor rights that they have as security agents and economic, social, and cultural and environmental rights is highlighted. Regarding methodology, the absence of the state in the establishment of teaching and pedagogical methodologies meant that these tasks were assumed by the instructors or the contracting companies of the training services. It is the case of the companies, especially the foreign ones, that have good practices and that we could identify in the interviews, and they devote attention specifically to the capacity of the agents that are working with them in some communities. The interviews highlighted the need to adapt the content and methodology to the public and their work and cultural needs. It is suggested that the methodologies used are suitable for an adult audience, which is why they're intended to be participatory and taking into account experience, role plays, use of videos, among others. And also, in times of COVID, everything had to be adequated. That is why SUCAMEC had a specific regulation to continue with the training, promoting its virtualization. It is some positive aspects. Flexibilization of logistical and territorial limitations were something positive regarding these geographical barriers that we were talking about. They had new alternatives to supply requirements in presential lessons. They adequate the content to the physical space that each of the agents have in their own houses, and the new opportunity to provide a new way of teaching courses. In the negative aspects, new challenges to achieve learning during virtual courses, and older agents had little or no experience with virtual platforms, which generates a breach, and unequal access to technology resource also here in Peru. Another aspect that could be positive or negative is that SUCAME has more opportunities to oversee online classes, but they have to, the program will know in advance when SUCAME is going to enter the class. So it would be easier to create a specific situation where they have all the standards, and rather in a randomized overseas. And regarding the last one, the good practices over this sector should be also acknowledged and used to improve the public policy. Some private companies have constant relationship with communities or other stakeholders, and they create a number of additional training and programs to improve capacities of their collaborators. That is why they force these agents to take complementary courses, and that includes capacities to interact with communities, includes the guiding principles and voluntary principles or another ISO standards. They usually implement virtual platforms even before the needs to be implemented by COVID. And in the context of sanitary crisis, they use these kind of platforms to give information about preventive measures. But it's also important to mention that according to agents that were interviewed, these courses usually respond more to the necessity of the companies and the need to have some specific checks rather than the interest of necessities of the agents itself and their work. This gives us a window of opportunity to improve the capacity and the training programs that they are doing specifically. So, for wrap up, some conclusions before ending the presentation. There are some needs to improve the adaptation of the human rights contents, and it is necessary to improve the coordinating among stakeholders related to this policy. It is important to learn and to improve good practices from companies itself, and there is a necessity to strain regulatory sanctions of user institutions in order to create incentive to formalization. So what are our next steps? And we have to, and the idea is to share these results with and through a participatory process to build together a policy paper. And the members of this participation process would be the members of the working group, the steering committee, and the assembly, and other private security sector companies that are not members of the groups, because we already have some of them inside the, another in governmental institutions related to these topics, for example, the Ministry of Education, that is also part of this policy, and other civil society members, like indigenous representative or in NGOs related to this approach. So this is it. Thank you very much, and we will be very happy to answer any question.
Thank you so much to Elizabeth Salmon from the IDEHPUCP and Bruce Barnaby. I think it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. Now we are going to have our discussant from IDEHPUCP, Tom Mather. Please, Tom.
Great, thank you, Jose, and thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Elizabeth, on a fast presentation. I mean, so I'm the head of compliance for IDEHPUCP, and just for the people who on the call who may not understand what IDEHPUCP is, ICOCA is security. We were humanitarian law, and ICOCA is the governance body for the international with voluntary principles. And we've been recognized as an organization which can help organizations achieve the the report is fascinating. I think it's timely, and it shows the challenges which are present in Peru, and these are challenges which are not unique to Peru. These are challenges we see in many other countries around the region, but also around the world. I mean, it's a complex problem. Ensuring human rights and respect for international humanitarian law in context around the world is it's challenging, and it requires a multifaceted solution. From the points which Elizabeth and Bruce really highlighted, the ones which jumped out to me was the problems with training, the informality of the sector, the fact that you don't have a fully regulated sector. These create huge problems with respect to human rights and the respect for human rights across Peru and in other countries as well. I think one thing which I would be really interested in hearing a little bit about, and I hope this doesn't kind of prejudge it, because this may go into kind of policy sides of things, but one thing that we at ICOCA see as a way to improve respect overall, and again we're working on this complex multifaceted problem also, is by really going to the private sector, companies which hire security companies to provide services for them, and trying to get them to be more exacting, more demanding in what they want from their private security providers. We can explain to people, if we explain to an organization that a poor security provider who does not respect human rights will actually increase your supply chain risks, that's often a way that we can bring about change in the industry in general. So I would just be interested in Elizabeth and Bruce in whether this is something you see as valuable in the context of Peru, and if it's something which you think can be addressed, or something, would you have optimism that this is a way to improve standards within Peru?
I'm sorry, Tom. I think I had a little bit of a problem with the sound. Can you please repeat the question very short?
I think Tom is having some issues with his connection.
Yeah, certainly. Apologies.
Sorry, Tom, we didn't hear your last comment.
Yeah, sure.
Repeat the question?
Yeah, no, sorry about this. I'm sitting in Switzerland. That's not really an issue I expect to have. Look, is educating the private sector, the people who hire private security companies, about the need for having responsible security, is that the key? Is that the solution to improving human rights, the respect for human rights in the private sector?
Well, it's a complex question, and educating the agents is one of the things that we need to do in order to improve the protection of human rights here in Peru regarding security sector. But obviously it's not the only one, and that's why we wanted to take a look for this policy, not only regarding the content and of the study program and the access to the study program, but to see how there are some barriers also to access this study program, in particular, the incentive to apply this content in particular, and also how we adapt this content to the different needs that the agents and the local communities have regarding these necessities and this and this sector in particular. So training is part of the straightening of the public policy in particular. It is not the only one, but we believe that in approaching the training program, we can see other problems that are regarding the sector, that are important for the sector, and we can propose a specific or some specific tools that can improve in the short term and some of the protections to human rights that we have. So it's a mixed response. It's not the only thing, but we think it's a good start to improve this sector right now here in Peru.
Okay, is that okay, Tom?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was a very good question. So now we are going to go to the question from the audience. And we have a very specific question for Bruce and Elizabeth. As you know, in Latin America, some cities, some neighborhoods, they have their own security patrol. For example, in Peru, they are called serenazgo. Those are these people that kind of provide some kind of security. So the question is, are these people under this law, is under SUCAMEC, or they are the responsibility of the municipalities? And if so, if there is something that can be done about this group, because they are also kind of a security personnel. Do you have any views about it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is a challenge for the regulations here in Peru. Serenazgo is it's a group, or it's a group of people that is under the municipality's regulation. They don't have, or they shouldn't have the competencies that the private security sector have. They can't use, for example, they can't be armed, or they can intervene people in directly. They can only oversee the streets and just report if anything is happening. But what do happen is, despite this specific competencies that they have that should not be related to security, they usually do have some incident and some relationship with the security over the municipalities. So it is a topic that it should be approached and to see how it have to be coordinated in the next steps, and how SUCAMEC should or not intervene, because it could also significate that we have more competencies for SUCAMEC, and they already have problems with the ones they have right now. So we have to see how it will and it can work in order to do something that can be useful for the public policy.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I think this is very interesting, because this idea of serenazgo, of these local patrols, like a local security, is not just in Peru, it's in Latin America and even in other continents that we have seen, like you have these personnel hired by municipalities in order to provide some kind of security, which face the same challenges that private security face. So that's very interesting. Now we have one of our questions for our friends from Colombia, the CME. They are saying that Latin America is facing a complex context in terms of conflict and social protests escalating to illegal and violent actions. Is Peru facing critiques from public opinion and civil society regarding private security abuses in the use of force? How companies and governments are promoting the voluntary principles and training to private security personnel to ensure security human rights are respected and protected?
Well, it's also a complex question. Here in Peru, we have two different regulations that interact in these social conflicts. The use of force for public security services and public security forces usually are mixed with the private services that they have, with these extraordinary services with contracts that they have with the companies. So when a social conflict arises, we have the public forces that sometimes have a contract with the private security and the private company, the extractive company or any company that are related to this conflict in particular. And we also have the private forces. So right now there are many civil society that are asking to eliminate these extraordinary services from the police and to change everything into private forces. So it sounds tempting in order to not charge and not complicate the police with these kind of issues, but it generates new challenges. How do we approach this social conflicts only with private security in these companies? So until now, we have to approach, and in the NAP process, we approach the security problem as a whole with the use of force, the public security services, and the extraordinary services that they bring, and the relationship with the private security companies itself. If the discussion is still on, we had a decision from the Constitutional Tribunal a couple of months ago relating specific to this topic, where they say that the contract should be only extraordinary. So the private security sector will have to be more present in these conflicts and the relationship with communities, which only highlight the importance to take a look at the sector and the training in human rights specifically.
Jose,
sorry. Yes, por favor.
Gracias. If I may just to follow what Bruce said, is that from my viewpoint, we are living in a very promising moment in Latin America, in Peru in particular. There is an increasing conscience about the risks, of having this private security sector without training in human rights. We have just seen the consequences. So I think that the public opinion, if I may use that expression, it has this conscience about the need to have this sector regulated with some specific rules, but also some training regarding how to deal with the problems we have. So I think that this is a very promising moment because of that, but also because we have the NAP, the National Action Plan. So this is a very good moment to start and to discuss and to deep a little bit to strengthen this process. On the other side, Jose, and just to finish, I'm very well aware of the time. I think that we are living an irreversible tendency. What do I mean? That we need to have conscience about business and human rights, and this is not reversible. We need to work on this because this is a very dynamic process and with specific problems. But the relationship between human rights and business it is here and it will increase in the next time. So we cannot just say, well, I pick and choose what I want to have, but this is a very, very structural subject and we need to work a lot on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And as you said, it is very important. This is not something like I've been fashioned about something. This is something that is needed, that society is asking for. Human rights is not trend. It's not a trend. Human rights is something that we have to deal with because society is kind of tired of some kind of injustice and inequalities. So very well said, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. I have one question. I'm conscious of the time. So just one last one that it says, are private security companies in Peru using the ISO 18788 standard for conducting security and respecting human rights? If yes, are companies getting certified? If not, why is the standard not used? I don't know, Bruce, if you or Elizabeth know something about that.
Yeah, we have to highlight the difference between the formal companies and the informal companies. So, and also that there are some bigger companies in the private security sector that are really focused on trying to show their compliance with international standards. But regarding that, there are some challenges only with how these standards are implemented by their agents and how you translate the standards into the regular practice of the companies in conflict situations. For example, if you have a multicultural state like ours in Peru, and the relationship with communities and different stakeholders, but also what do we do with the how we reach the informal and companies and the relationship with these standards as well. So, and you can find that some specific companies, the bigger ones, will have this not only these ESOs, but only the voluntary principles as well, a couple of them. But there are problems with the implementation, and there are problems with the other many companies that we have right now.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bruce. I think we are closing this session. I really appreciate all of you, your participation. Something that is very important and I like about your presentation is the fact that when we talk about human rights, it's not just the human rights of the people affected by private security operation, but also of the personnel, of the private security personnel. Because we cannot deny that there is a huge lack of professionalization of the sector. Private security personnel are mostly people who barely have some high school education. So, and they are also in many cases mistreated. And I cannot name many cases also of discrimination against women, etc., etc. I think that is something that is very important to understand, that when we talk about private security, we are talking about both sides. Interactions at the respect of human rights of public security personnel. Something that is very important and is the case not only in Latin America and Peru, but in other continents, is the informality. The informality is a big limitations when we are talking about regulation. Because if a big percentage of our private security companies are informal, our regulations are actually not going to reach or are not going to get the change that we are looking for. So I really, really appreciate your time. To all the audience, thank you so much. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Tom. It was an amazing presentation. If someone in the audience has any additional question, please feel free to send us an email to the Secretariat, to me, to Jose, and we are going to try to answer your question. Thank you so much for your time. So we hope to see you in another event. So thank you again to IDEHPUCP. Thank you again to ICOCA for being here. And thank you to all of you for participating. Have a great day or afternoon or night, wherever in the world you are. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.